Good. So you should be able to see that now, I assume.
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to put it on. Yeah, good. There's been a lot of, conversation so far. I mean, there are certain basic things that need to be, I think, clarified if we are to be taken seriously in working toward a new paradigm. First of all, is the concept of paradigm itself. And, is a, in other words, to say paradigm, and if we're thinking about T.S. Kuhn and the structure of scientific revolutions, where that term first came, it cannot simply be about piecemeal reform. We're talking about systemic change, whether it is social, cultural, and as it shapes the economy. Now, so we have to be looking for resources at that level. The principle of subsidiarity that I want to talk about is one of those resources for systemic change that moves the conversation from the what, and Catholic social teaching has a lot to say about the what, that is our goals, namely the common good, human dignity, social justice, et cetera, and the how. So you're shifting from what to how. That is, how do we achieve our aspirations or goals toward these things that would be to have a transformative impact on economics. Well, the principle of subsidiarity is an answer. It is slightly less than 100 years old, at least in its, the way in which it is surfeited in Catholic social teaching. And I think it would be good to examine it. And we see that it is the subject, it is continuing to develop. It is not just something that has been set in stone once and for all as we go along. Okay. What is the principle of subsidiarity then? The principle which first surfaced in Quadragesimo Anno in 1931 was meant as a warning indicating the proper ways in which interventions from government can and should assist persons and families to fulfill their purposes. The word subsidiarity comes from the Latin subsidium, which effectively means assistance. And it is couched in terms that are, the relationship between the state and the associations honeycombing society. What kind of assistance from the state can be expected, and how are they to be delivered? It was issued as a warning. It was in the context of the struggle in Italy at the time against, the usurpations by the fascist government of Mussolini, trying to take over the church's influence on and organizations in Catholic education. And so the idea was that the state, in offering assistance or helping to organize a particular sector of the economy or society, should not usurp the function of so-called lower entities that they ostensibly are meant to assist. Solutions to social problems must respect the dignity of all human beings, the rights of natural associations like families, and the common good. So here's the classical statement of it. I'm not going to read it to you, but it's in number 79. Those of you who like to look at the original text, paragraph 79 in Quadragesimo Anno. It is an injustice and at the same time a grave evil and disturbance of right order to assign to a greater and higher association what lesser and subordinate organizations can do. Now, the context, as I say, of this was the struggle with Mussolini over control of Catholic institutions. In trying to interpret or decipher what it means for us today, you have to overcome certain tacit assumptions in it, which assumed that authoritarianism was a normal and the inevitability of a hierarchical social order. Nevertheless, it is a clear focus on the state and how it provides assistance to primary human groups. Now note, and there's a lot of controversy, or there has been at different times, it has become a political football, let's say in the United States, where sometimes it is interpreted as if it were an endorsement of a minimalist view of government or the so-called watchman state offered by libertarianism. Emphatically, it is not. Okay. Once it became clear that the principle had applications beyond its original meaning, you know, it really has much broader applications, perennial questions of how to create forms of public assistance. And a part of that is what our agenda is here, because of course, public assistance, or the help that institutions can give one another in fulfilling their economic and social goals is crucial for trying to figure out how a new paradigm might emerge. One of the most innovative developments is are several paragraphs in the vocation of the business leader, which we've talked about yesterday. And here are some of the high points of that. 3 practical steps in managerial responsibility, you know, that actually are flagged as an application of the principle of subsidiarity or subsidiary function. We have this statement: subsidiary business structures therefore should nurture mutual respect and responsibility and allow employees to attribute good results to their sincere engagement. In other words, it's about empowerment, trying to place decision-making at the closest to where the decisions, those affected by the decisions, are involved. So it's inherently democratic. It is inherently moving the context for decision-making away from top management and toward the workers, engagement of the workers and other stakeholders in a business. You know, that would become a hallmark of managerial responsibility. In a sense, in fact, it even uses that word. The managerial responsibility means becoming a servant leader. So this goes beyond the delegation of authority from top to bottom. It requires, particularly with those who have the power, who are at the commanding heights of an organization, it requires a certain set of virtues that enable self-discipline and restraint on the part of the executive leadership group, so that subordinates might be empowered to exercise their own freedom and intelligence. Some of this reminded me, I've been teaching business ethics for a long time, of Peter Drucker and what he said in The Practice of Management, 1954, where he gave me a seminal idea that, you know, I've tried to practice ever since as a teacher, that the manager is essentially a teacher, which is the key to the empowerment strategies that are involved. Now, in our particular applications of it in the paradigm, you know, I want to focus on empowering the poor, and that the real question for empowering the poor means, how do you provide access to capital? And so, you know, much is in the same way that my colleague Andrew So will be talking about later. We can talk about Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, or credit unions and microfinance, that is, or credit unions in the Philippines, or both. Now, one of the breakthroughs here that has been made, that is empirically demonstratable, Eunice from Grameen Bank was very much on this, that you have to overcome the moral hazard that inhibits the development of banking or borrowing, lending institutions, particularly involved in the poor. And again, this is also a question of human dignity and trust. The risk involved in extending credit to anyone is no greater among the poor than with the rich if the loan is managed properly. Well, what does it then mean to manage the loans in such a way that that moral hazard of default on a loan is minimized? It means empowering local networks and organizing them as accountability structures, ensuring compliance of all participants. Now, this is an idea that Yunus, in his own Muslim context in Bangladesh, more or less discovered on his own, but it is also parallel to some of the basic premises regarding human dignity and empowerment that are involved in well-managed credit unions and cooperatives that have been encouraged by Catholic social teaching. So from what to how? For such a scheme to work, however, there must be access to capital. That is, a credit cooperative or credit union must create a working relationship with higher institutions, so-called, private or public, among them conventional banks. In other words, where does a credit union get the money from which to make loans to carry on their activities? Well, I mean, one source would be simply to pool the resources of the people, a membership organization, as they contribute to the organization, that provides the capital for providing loans. But there's also as you scale up, there is a question of how you begin to develop an institution for economic empowerment. And this inevitably will involve you in some kind of a relationship, we hope transformative, with existing conventional banking. The perennial challenge for implementing the principle of subsidiarity, this has to be admitted. This is something that the study of credit union history, as well as cooperatives, there is the risk that is inherent in success. After all, we're still dealing with human beings and original sin, if you will. That is the greed that is in all of us, that the state may seek to appropriate the micro-banking enterprise, usurp their resources, et cetera, for their own purposes, which may be political or finding it convenient to reorganize them as government agencies. If the state seeks to expropriate these institutions, that of course would be a violation of the principle of subsidiarity, and therefore we have to block, the path that moves in that direction. Now, we can also think about the sad history or the mixed history of credit unions in the Philippines during the Marcos dictatorship. Would give you quite a bit of example of that, and how the credit unions after Marcos dictatorship was ended, how they have recovered their autonomy and their capacity to operate in a successful way. That would also be part of the story. So we have the whole question, what is poverty and how to overcome it? One thing is that poverty today is not a natural condition to be endured like other acts of God. It is a result of systemic failure, the corruption of economic systems, their manipulation in favor of the interests of some groups over others. The rich are no more moral or deserving than the poor. Honoring human dignity, if it is truly understood, must learn to set aside traditional prejudices against the others who do not share in our prosperity. If a new economic paradigm is to fulfill its promise, we must learn to trust empowerment strategies that are open to all people. In fact, to seek out ways to create such structures, and that's the promise of principle of subsidiarity. Creating a new economic paradigm at its roots is a spiritual struggle, calling on all people to repent of their complicity in unjust social structures, and all of us are complicit, in order to work with all others to discover ways of sharing the gifts that God has given us. So, my clock says I'm out of time. We are at the end of our presentation. So the principle of subsidiarity is a resource. It's a resource, that was developed within Catholic social teaching. It continues to expand. It now has great promise for how we think about, finance, the development of institutions that can empower the poor through increased access to capital, et cetera. So thank you very much. I turn it back over to Rod.